Hello and welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke. We just had another full day of football, a lot of interesting games. We are at the midpoint of the season, finally starting to make our way to the fantasy playoffs, hopefully starting to clinch playoff spots in a couple leagues in the next few weeks. And then the fantasy playoffs are right around the corner. So it was a very interesting day in terms of utilization, in terms of how players were used. Last week, there was a lot of stuff around wide receivers. This week, there was a lot on running backs and tight ends. Still a little bit on wide receivers, a lot more of it having to do with injuries, either players coming back from injury and players who got hurt and how they were replaced. So we will jump right ahead into the first running back situation, and that is with the Dallas Cowboys. Rico Dowdle ended up playing the clear majority of snaps for Dallas this week, which was good to see for Dowdle after so much time. A bit of drama going on behind the scenes apparently in Dallas. Ezekiel Elliott was inactive for this game, did not fly with the team, and it was good. And Elliott, with him staying home, it sounds like there was a lot of disciplinary issues, a lot of him either missing meetings or consistently being late to meetings, and that had to do with it. I would not be at all surprised if Elliott is not on the team in the near future, considering how ineffective he was. And Dowdle ended up playing a lot this week. So he played well in his time, ran the ball 12 times, 75 yards, caught 5 passes, 32 receiving yards, and a touchdown, which was all good to see. Dalvin Cook, for the second straight week, was elevated from the practice squad. Last week, Cook was in a rotation with Elliott being the second player in that rotation, and they were doing the same rotation by drive that Dallas had done basically throughout the entire season. And this is the first week that they really stayed away from that trend. Hunter Lupke ended up playing the passing downs as usual, which is why Dowdle wasn't closer to 100% of snaps. But Cook really only took 2 snaps early on, and then in the second half took 4 plays in a row on a drive. But that was it. Cook just played the 6 offensive snaps. The only concern I really have for Dowdle going forward is there is the trade deadline on Tuesday, and if any team is trading for a running back, it's probably Dallas. Maybe slightly less likely now because Dowdle played so well. But if they do end up cutting Elliott, and Cook really hasn't amounted to much so far, Dallas could very well want a second running back. So, and then also the Dak Prescott injury, we'll find out how bad that is. But if Prescott's out, that's going to hurt everyone in the offense. It's going to hurt the running game. It's going to hurt the receivers. Not great all around. So it'll definitely be worth keeping an eye on Prescott's injury. But just in general, good to see for Dowdle, someone who had been playing a little bit more, and we were hoping that he would have a good game like this. Ideally would have been able to run the ball even more than he did in this game, but still good to see him get the 75 yards, get the receiving touchdown, get a bit of work in the receiving game. Other running back situation I wanted to cover, mostly because it was perplexing to me, so mostly wanted to think out loud, and that's with Jahmyr Gibbs. Last week, he saw a season low in terms of percentage of offensive snaps. It was his lowest since early in his rookie season, but that was really easy to explain. He didn't play in the fourth quarter. The Lions were winning in a blowout game. He had already run for 100 yards, no big deal. But this week, he did not play at all in the first quarter of the game. And then in the second quarter, he only played 4 snaps. Throughout this year, and even going back to last year, the Lions tended to start with Montgomery, got him rolling, and then mixed Gibbs in. So we've seen games this season, roughly half of them where it was more of a 50-50 split in terms of first quarter snaps. Other games where Montgomery was clearly in the lead, but Gibbs still would sneak in a little bit here and there. And then the second quarter part was even more perplexing, that Gibbs only played 4 snaps. It made me think that there could be like some injury situation we didn't know about or something like that. But then Gibbs played a lot in the second half, played 18 of 31 snaps, ran the ball 11 times for 65 yards and a touchdown, caught a pass where Montgomery, he ran 17 times, 73 yards, caught 3 passes for 23 yards. So a lot of times when there's like a backup running back who's playing really well and we complain about it that the team should be playing the starter, this feels a little different just because the Lions are winning. They're 7-1. Montgomery is a good running back, even if we could argue that Gibbs is a better running back. And since the Lions are 7-1, if anything, fighting for a position in the playoffs rather than trying to make the playoffs and trying to make it far in the playoffs once they get there, you can't really get mad at them for trying to conserve their better running back since they're going to need him once the playoffs hit. So a little frustrating for fantasy managers for Gibbs, especially when we've seen other running backs this week playing more than we've seen, like we just talked about with Dowdle. In Miami, A-Chain is playing more and more each week, even with the Dolphins running backs healthy. So that has been great to see. So that's, I don't know if there's really anything to take away from this with the Lions. There's a chance that Gibbs will be going back to normal next week and be just fine, and the playing time will be normal, and this was just an anomaly where they saw something where they thought using Montgomery early in the game was going to give them an advantage, and it did help them get a lead. So it'll just be something worth monitoring, but it's just odd that Gibbs in back-to-back games didn't see much playing time, and over the course of 3 quarters only played 4 snaps over the course of the 2 games. Moving on to wide receivers, the Baltimore Ravens, they are probably one of the most interesting teams this season in terms of how they've been utilizing players. Tight ends have been the big thing, but wide receivers are now part of that because they traded for Deontay Johnson. They're interesting in that they have 4 personnel groupings that they use significantly. A lot of teams just use 2 significantly. We just had the Colts game finish a little bit ago, and they use a lot of 11 and 12 personnel, and that's mostly it. So there's not much variation in what they're doing. They have the 2 clear outside receivers. Josh Downs plays in 11 personnel. The weird thing for them this week is they played more 12 personnel, but for the Ravens, they use 11 personnel, 12 personnel, 21 personnel, and 22 personnel very significantly. And they have some pretty clear players that they like using in those different personnel groupings, particularly at tight end in 12 personnel. It's almost always Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. In 22 personnel, it's almost always Isaiah Likely and Charlie Kolar. So Deontay Johnson, once he got traded to the Ravens, it clearly was going to mess with how they rotate their wide receivers in and out of games. What we saw is, in general, the Ravens played their starters for 8 drives. They had a big lead. They put in their backups for the last 2 drives. Not going to worry about those last, I think it was just 2 drives for this analysis because I don't think it matters for what the Ravens will do going forward. We saw in 11 personnel, they only used 11 personnel on 9 plays with the starters. And Deontay Johnson was in for 2 of those 9 plays. Both of them were in place of Nelson Aguilar. So we saw Deontay Johnson and Rashad Bateman on the outside, Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews on the inside. I think eventually that's going to be the norm for them in 11 personnel. If there are any games that are more competitive than this and the Ravens have to pass the ball a lot, that's kind of what I expect to see. So I think 11 personnel is going to be big for me in terms of how we're going to view Deontay Johnson going forward. I think he needs to be playing close to 100% of those snaps. Then the interesting stuff is what happened in 12 and 21 personnel. We saw Johnson take 4 of the 12 snaps in 12 personnel, all of which were in place of Zay Flowers. And then in 21 personnel, it was a big rotation of 4 players. Johnson played 7 of 22 snaps there. So still not a lot. And a lot of that happened more in the 3rd quarter of the game where the Ravens already had a lead. So for me, this was interesting in what it did to Zay Flowers. Flowers, someone who's always played significantly in 11 personnel, over the first 8 weeks, played 95% of the 12 personnel snaps, 72% of 21 personnel. And then in this game, ignoring the drives where the starters weren't playing, that dropped down to 58% of 12 personnel. So nearly a 40% drop in snaps. And then in 21 personnel, it was 43. So nearly a 30% drop in snaps in that personnel grouping. But it's also worth noting that a lot of that did happen later in the 3rd quarter when the Ravens had a lead. So it's hard to know how much stock we should be taking into that because the Ravens were winning by a lot in the game, and some of this happened not quite in garbage time, but getting close to it. So I think one of two things will happen. Either Deontay Johnson will lose almost all of his fantasy value this year, just be a rotational player, not taking much snaps in anything outside of 11 personnel, in which case Zay Flowers will be fine, Rashad Bateman will be fine. But there is also a chance that if Deontay Johnson is going to see more playing time, it could look similar to what it did in the third quarter, in which case Zay Flowers is going to see a significant decrease in snaps. And it's kind of ironic that this is happening the same week where Flowers caught 4 passes, had a ton of yards, scored 2 touchdowns. So I don't know if that played any role in this at all either, but if Deontay Johnson is going to earn any more playing time this year than what we saw this week, it could very well be at the expense of Flowers rather than Rashad Bateman like we thought earlier, because it was Flowers that he was taking time away from in this game. Other wide receiver situation, I know people in the chat have been asking about Chris Olave and his rest of season, what we think about him. He has posted on Twitter that he's fine, which is great to see. It's been good to see that he was already discharged from the hospital as well. My only concern is that this is the 5th concussion in his career that we've known about, and also the second one in the past 3 weeks. So even though he might be fine in a sense that like he's out of the hospital, he's conscious and everything, I don't know if that's going to be fine enough for him to play football again in the near future, since 5 concussions in a lifetime is a lot. And that's just what I know of. At least there's a chance he had some in high school that I just don't know of, or others in college that weren't reported or anything like that. And the short time period that they've occurred, it was just week 6 that he suffered one previously that he missed time for. So I'm probably concerned, but I think we should probably wait a day or two. Hopefully you don't need to make any decisions about Olave in general until we hear more. I wouldn't be surprised if he misses time. I wouldn't be surprised if he misses a lot of time. And especially once you consider the Saints' record and their minimal chances of making the playoffs this year, it makes a lot more sense for Olave to be cautious right now and think more about the long term of his career than try to get back as soon as possible. So not great for him. And if he does miss time, it would have meant great things for Bub Means because he was the backup to Olave, but he just landed on injured reserve. So if anything, I think it's just going to mean more for the running backs, more for the tight ends, like it did in this game. They barely used 11 personnel despite being down at times in the game and ultimately losing the game. And they just stuck with having 2 tight ends on the field, a lot of Taysom Hill touching the ball, which was good to see for Hill's fantasy value. But Alvin Kamara we have breaking news, so I'm going to break away from that right now. The Raiders have fired Luke Getsy as their offensive coordinator. So that's being reported by Tom Pelissero right now. If I can see my tweet decks up there for those who are watching. My instant reaction for the Raiders, I don't know what this will mean at quarterback. They did bench their quarterback in this game. I don't know if they'll try to trade for a quarterback at the deadline, considering their quarterback situation, and they haven't been happy with anyone this year. In general, I don't see it changing the fantasy value too much at wide receiver or tight end. Whoever is calling plays on offense is going to be calling plays to get passes to Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers. Those are their 2 clear weapons on offense. The one thing that I think will be interesting is what they do at running back. We saw some interesting stuff in this game in that over the first 2 drives, we saw Zamir White get more involved than we had seen in the past month or so. But then the Raiders already fell behind by that 3rd and 4th drive, and he ended up not seeing the ball. And then Amir Abdullah has been their running back whenever they're down by 2 touchdowns at least. That has happened throughout the season when they've been down by 2 touchdowns. That happened again this week. So Amir Abdullah ended up leading the offense in snaps, or the backfield in snaps. I think the Raiders would be an interesting team if they chose to make a trade at running back, since there's a couple running backs. Khalil Herbert comes to mind. Miles Sanders comes to mind, that are going to be down the depth charts and could find a new home. And the Raiders would be a good destination because they haven't really been happy with any of their running backs so far. And Getsy in general felt like someone that made sense for them to hire in order to make Devontae Adams happy, because Getsy had a history with Adams, multiple stints with the Packers, and each time he joined the Packers, Adams took a step forward in his career. And now that Adams is no longer with the Raiders, I can see it being a little more understandable that they might not want Getsy as offensive coordinator with Adams not there. Plus, it was potentially either that or the loss of their head coach. So we've seen this before where the head coach decides to make a change just to help make sure that he doesn't get fired. So I don't know if that played into it as well, but that is the Raiders offensive coordinator situation. We'll find out who ends up calling plays for them going forward and how that ends up impacting things. But just off the top of my head, that was my thoughts on the Raiders. Next, I want to go through two tight end situations before we wrap up today. First thing is the Los Angeles Rams, where it is the end of Colby Parkinson's season. Early in the season, he was seeing a very high percentage of offensive snaps after signing with the Rams. Even played, I think it was 100% of snaps that one game, or maybe missed one snap, but was very consistently seeing the field. After the Rams bye week, we saw a significant decrease in snaps, but a lot of those were on run plays. He was still seeing the clear majority of passing down snaps. So even though it was slightly concerning, it wasn't a huge deal. But also part of the reason we were so high on Parkinson before is because of the injuries at wide receiver, thinking that he could see a higher target share. And that never ended up materializing in a way that made Parkinson a fantasy starter over any period of time there. And this week we saw another decrease in snaps. It kind of started happening a little bit at the start of the game, but then just kind of continued to progress throughout the game, where Davis Allen was the one to rotate in more often. Parkinson's 32 of the possible 77 snaps, only 20 of the 44 routes. So the big thing here was not just the decrease in snaps, but the snaps he lost were on passing plays. And then Allen was on the field for 42 snaps, so Allen on the field for 10 more snaps than Parkinson. Ran 21 routes, so one more route, and then he was targeted 3 times, unlike Parkinson. So Parkinson, I've probably, when I write my 5 players to cut tomorrow, Parkinson will probably be on that list, since it seems very unlikely he'll have fantasy value at any point over the rest of the season. It is also worth noting Tyler Higbee, someone who suffered that injury late last season, has been out so far this year. I have not heard any updates on him basically since the season started. The Rams were also pretty quiet about any status updates on him throughout the preseason and training camp as well. If he is coming back this season, it would be late in the season, but there's at least a chance Higbee could come back at some point this season, in which case, before it seemed unlikely that he would take over this tight end job because Parkinson seemed to clearly have that job and they paid him a lot of money. But now it seems more likely that Higbee could come back this season and could regain that starting job. Last tight end situation I want to cover, and that is Kyle Pitts. And for the second straight week, he saw a pretty notable decrease in snaps from what we were seeing earlier in the season. A very similar thing happened each of the last 2 games. We saw the Falcons over the first 5 or 6 drives end up with a pretty nice lead. Over those 6 drives, Pitts was seeing significant amount of snaps. He played 27 of 35 snaps over those first, I think, 6 drives in this game. But then it was just 4 of 22 snaps over the rest of the game, which was not great to see. And a very similar thing happened last week. The Falcons had a slight lead in the second half of the game and then switched to Charlie Warner to be their run blocking tight end. And that meant Pitts was off the field the majority of the time. And that meant he was also off the field for some of the pass routes in the game. So there is a lot of times where we see teams, if they're winning games late in the third quarter, fourth quarter, start to switch to some of their more run-heavy players, more run-blocking tight ends, run-blocking wide receivers, switch to a backup running back, those kind of things. What I think the difference is in this case is the Falcons are doing it a lot earlier in the game than we typically see teams do that kind of thing for. So it's been either halftime or early third quarter in both of these cases. And it's also a case where the Falcons don't have this like huge lead. They're only up by a touchdown, maybe 10 points, and maybe expand their lead over the course of the rest of the game. But it's not taking a whole lot for Pitts to be out of the game for Atlanta. And the Falcons have a decently favorable schedule for them. We could see more cases like this where the Falcons have a lead, especially when you look at the fantasy playoffs. They have some matchups where the Falcons could definitely end up with a lead, in which case Pitts could barely play in the second half of those games, maybe not play much near the end of the first half if the Falcons end up with a big lead early on. So not great news for Pitt's fantasy managers. I'm pretty sure he had a decent week a week ago, but did not do much in this game in terms of his receiving. So I think, in my opinion, ideally, he has a good game in the next week or two. And if you have him on your fantasy roster, then you try to trade him, because if the Falcons keep using him in this kind of role where anytime they're up by a little bit, he's basically stops playing, that is not great for his fantasy production. Last note, now that I've gone through the 5 things, I thank you for the congratulations. If you saw on social media, I had mentioned that I am now full-time fantasy at PFF for the past 5 years or so. I had been splitting my time both on the business-to-business side, doing software development for half the year, and then doing this fantasy football stuff for the other half of the year. Now I'll be able to do fantasy full-time for PFF rather than splitting my time between the two roles. So that'll mean for the podcast, I'll be able to be on the podcast a lot more once we reach January up until June. Last year, I think I only did like 2 episodes, one around free agency, one with the draft. So I'll be able to be on with John a lot more than I was last season. That'll also mean more content for me in the off season. I'll be able to cover free agency more thoroughly, the draft more thoroughly. And then once the season hits, I'll also have a lot more time to prepare for the season, prepare for some new things, dynasty content as well. And since like right now, my in-season content, it's been pretty similar the past couple of years. So luckily, like people have been able to get used to my recap articles, my waiver article, so on and so forth. But hopefully I'll be able to come up with some new things, come up with more graphics to use in the articles, find more stats that are more relevant, make my rankings even more accurate, hopefully add another trophy to that trophy case behind me in the next couple of years. So hopefully that'll be big things both for me, but also for all of you as well. Hopefully I'll be able to get better fantasy content for you in general. Outside of that, it'll be a pretty typical week for me at PFF. Written content will be the same as usual. I have the recap article up right now, so anyone who wants to know anything that happened through the games today that I did not cover here, you can go through that recap. We'll have the waiver wire article out tomorrow, top 10 recap tomorrow, Monday Night Football recap as well. The following day, we'll have my rest of season rankings. We'll have 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high. My rankings will be out Tuesday afternoon like usual. And then we'll have start set later in the week. And then podcast-wise, John will have his usual IDP recap tomorrow morning, as well as his other IDP show later in the week. He and I will be on together for waivers on Tuesday. Interesting week for quarterback and tight ends, some decent wide receivers, but another bad week for running backs. So that's not going to be great if you need a running back on your team. And then he will also be back with Nick for the start sit show later in the week. It's always great when you are working for 15, 16 straight hours every Sunday. So that'll basically cover it. If you have any other questions, always hit me up on Twitter as well. I'm happy to answer questions when I can. And like I said, the recap is there. Also, if you have a PFF Plus subscription, I know people like my snap count tweets that I do on Thursdays and Mondays. If you were looking for snap counts throughout the day on Sundays, they are updated in our premium stats. So you need a PFF Plus subscription for that. Also a PFF Plus subscription for my rankings for most of my other non-recap articles. For example, the waiver article tomorrow and my start sit one later. So if you don't have PFF Plus, I would definitely suggest getting that. And that'll cover it for me. One more question. Do I like what I see about Cortland Sutton with Knicks at quarterback? Sutton has looked very good the last 2 weeks. He has been the one consistent thing Denver has had at wide receiver. They've changed what they've done at all the other wide receiver spots. Sutton has consistently been number one, and Knicks has impressed me so far this season. So good to see him have those back-to-back 100-yard games, and I think he can generally be a fantasy starter depending on the matchup each week. Off the top of my head, I don't think the Broncos have the greatest schedule for wide receivers over the rest of the season, so that's probably working against him. A little bit below average schedule, but I still like what I've seen with him going forward. And then Tillman as well with the Cleveland Browns. He has looked good, but the Browns have the clear worst schedule for wide receivers, or the second worst schedule for wide receivers over the rest of the way, worst one in the fantasy playoffs. So while I have liked what I've seen so far, I think the schedule is going to make it rough for him to continue doing what he's done. So I think that'll pretty much cover everything. Gone a little bit longer than I have usually on these Sundays. So with that, I will say peace out, and I will finish my waiver wire article. Have a good one.